So the next module we're going to talk about is trauma's effects. And this is the third module, and it includes 3 videos. And after this, we'll take a break. So just so you know, after this module, we'll take a break. And it'll be about 11:15 at that point. This module is divided into 3 sections. The first video that we're going to look at specifically speaks to the impact of trauma on mental health and how maybe trauma looks like mental health problems. The second one talks about high-risk behaviors, and the last one then will address substance use and the connection with trauma. One area that we like to start with is to think about the impact that trauma has on the person's biological makeup, their health. Because that may be exactly what brings them into you in the first place, or bring them to the emergency room over and over again, is the impact that it has on their health. We know from the ACE studies that every negative outcome that's ever been measured in all of the ACE studies, the risk is elevated the more ACEs someone has. The more trauma they have in their past, the worse their outcomes are as an adult. And I mean, we could pull it out of the hat, every outcome you can think of. They're more likely to have preterm births. They're more likely to have ulcers, heart attacks, engage in interpersonal violence, both as the intimate partner violence, both as the perpetrator and the victim of that. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to have hypertension, on and on and on. And if someone's health isn't good, all of the other stuff is really kind of hard to make sense out of. I mean, we know a lot of people in the criminal justice system have very poor health, until recently didn't even have access to health care, primary care. And we know more and more programs now are trying to wrap around primary care into their approach to someone. If someone doesn't have teeth or has not seen a dentist ever in their lifetime, tooth pain is really bad, and you want them to go without opiates when they need 10 root canals? We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't have those expectations for ourselves. So, and it might be hypertension. It could be any number of medical problems, but many people in the justice system have not had adequate medical care ever in their lives, let alone prenatal care when their mothers were carrying them. So the effect of trauma on the body is enormous. And it's something that may be exactly what brings someone into the emergency room, that may lead to you're learning something about them, that perhaps they were sexually assaulted, or that or this is just one in a number of assaults that they've had. Keeping in mind then that the behavior that gets them into trouble in the first place is in many cases their survival tool. It might be what gets them arrested. It might be what makes them really your least favorite client to see every week. They may be pushing back, be missing appointments, etc. But that is, for many, the way they survive. So that's really important to keep in mind. Really, you think about that trauma is universal, what trauma is, and that the behaviors, and in the justice system, that's what's bringing them to you, is how they've survived up until this point. And from the videos that we've seen already, there's some great examples of that, and I encourage you to think of your own as we're watching. BJ talked about, I learned to fight to take care of myself. I got big. Protected herself in the neighborhood and in her home because her mother physically beat her. I was tired of being the prey, so I turned into the predator. Thomas talks specifically about that, both in and outside of the institutions. I became an instigator because I feel I needed to have the upper hand. Stephanie talked about if she thought something was going to escalate to violence, she just instigated it. Get it over with. And you hear a lot of people who are involved in intimate partner violence doing that. They know that Friday is going to be a bad day, so they just go at it the minute their abuser comes through the door to get it over with. Because it's going to happen anyway. It's inevitable. So they at least have the upper hand and can control when it happens. So that's something which may seem very counterproductive to people, but it is something that works for them and has worked. This is a way of really depicting all of the different ways in which the long-term effects that trauma can have on people. If you look at the center here, these are words that we heard from both of the officers, we heard from people we've seen on the videos. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of powerlessness, there's a lot of anger, a lot of pain. This is where the trauma is residing. And the way it shows up is in physical health issues. It shows up in mental health issues. and we're going to see that, that's the first video we're going to see. There is a lot of overlap between what we think is mental illness and what is actually trauma. Okay, there's a lot of overlap. Behavioral problems, that's why you know them. Poor relationships, not only with friends and family, it could be with coworkers. Okay, people who work in an environment where they have, where they are living with trauma, maybe as part of their job or not, can maybe make not great coworkers. And then lastly, substance abuse, which is something which, again, gets people into trouble, or we observe that they're using a lot of substances. So the first video, if you turn to activity pack number 7, the first video is the longest in this module as well, okay? I just like to tell people that so they don't think all of them are going to be this long. And if you want to make note of the different symptoms of mental illness along the way, just for your own notes, you can do that on page 7. Okay. Can anybody give me an example of what, just how mental illness and trauma might get a little confused? I mean, if you're making sort of a quick assessment of someone, yeah.
Well, for example, when the woman said, I just want to die, I just want to die, you know, that generally people would assume that that is a mental health issue as opposed to being, you know, it seemed like she probably had some kind of sexual trauma in her past, and instead of addressing that, they might just address the immediate.
And she wanted to die because she wanted people to stop touching her.
Yeah.
You know, and that was a big part of that, yeah.
I think all of those symptoms, when you look at them, you know, hopelessness, powerlessness, low self-esteem, all of those symptoms are either reasonable responses to what happened or a way that people cope. So fear and anxiety, for example. If you think back from someone being a young child and then being sexually abused or physically abused, you never know when your abuser is going to come on and beat you or sexually or rape you. So you learn to always be on guard. So fear and anxiety often meant safety. Same with dissociation, or you know, it makes sense that someone would want to drift away because they couldn't escape physically. They could escape emotionally. So
I think when you look at avoidance too, you avoid the place where the trauma may occur. But if you're a substance abuser, you may look that would be a place where it got high, and so you avoid, you know, the place.
And Kenya talked about staying in her house all the time. That she just went to work, came home, went in her room as a way of avoiding of that. Yeah.
Well, one thing I always observe with female offenders is they seem to have this hyper emotional thing going on all the time, and that, you know, if you don't know that they've had trauma, it seems sometimes like mental illness, because you're like, why are they responding so inappropriately to?
And provocative and hypersexuality too, right? And what do we sometimes call that diagnostically? What do we call that sometimes diagnostically? A lot of what their behaviors they're describing that were their coping mechanisms. Borderline personality disorder.
And in kids, you see a lot of misdiagnosed kids. A lot of kids being misdiagnosed with ADHD, bipolar. That's very common.
Yeah, and so that's something. This is really as a way to get us to think about. It may look like mental illness, but it may be trauma. Some of the overlap is very. There's no blood test for any of this. There's a lot of overlap, and we also know people who actually have a mental illness are more at risk for trauma. And we also know that the trauma is then going to exacerbate the real underlying mental illness. So it's a really vicious cycle. But to just regard it as a problem with mental health and not with trauma is missing part of it. And when we start wondering why people relapse in their treatment regimes, it may be that it's not the mental illness that's leading to the relapse. Once the mental illness is part of the coping mechanism, the avoidance, and etc. And just keeping that as a part of our awareness and incorporating that into our screening and assessments to rule it out. But as we know, for people in the justice system, if they have a mental illness, it's probably not going to be ruled out. Yeah.
How, like, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, but how, if you took trauma out of the picture, how much mental illness would be there? How much, do Do we have?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like, if you took it out, the true mental illness, like, what would that be? Because I think that when you have trauma, your mental health is compromised, so.
I work in community mental health, and I want to say probably 95% people that are coming to and seeking help have a history of trauma.
Well, and I think part of it is that the integrated treatments are really important. You know, is it just being part of the treatment, just like we know now with many people, substance abuse and mental illness need to be treated together, not one primary and one secondary. We're suggesting trauma should be in that piece as well.
And if there's, people who have histories of mental health conditions, and because they're parents, so they were probably traumatized because of the parents or historical mental health conditions. So it's kind of interconnected, pretty separate.
So the next video is much shorter, and it's about high-risk behaviors and poor relationships that can arise out of trauma and the way in which people behave as part of that. So activity pack number 8, and I will consistently forget to do that. So I'm just, you'll always see it there on the video screen.
The thought of being harmed or being in a risky situation, like I didn't have any kind of filter about that like most people would. I also started acting out sexually, and so I was sleeping with older guys. I mean, I was in the 4th grade and I was sleeping with guys that were like in middle school and high school.
I put myself in a lot of dangerous situations, a lot being in places where I was the only female body person, with a lot of men who were doing a lot of things illegally, where I could have gotten myself hurt. I put myself in situations where I had to fight men, where I knew that I probably would get hurt, hoping that I would get hurt enough to die.
High-risk behaviors was really just kind of how I functioned on a daily basis. I would jump out of moving cars sometimes, or run down the freeway a lot. I would run down the freeway. I'd hitchhike from anywhere. I hitchhiked for years and years and years. I was violent. I would take on a man 4 times my size for looking at me wrong in a bar or making a pass at me.
I didn't know what danger was. If somebody had some dope and said, look, come in this alley with 5 strangers, they was like, come on in the alley, we're gonna get high, I would go. That wasn't dangerous to me. So because people took things from me, sex as a kid, sexually abusing me in my home, when I got out on the street, I made sure people sexually abused me. I mean, I intentionally sought out people who were gonna hurt me. Going to emergency rooms, beaten up, in the emergency room, nurse looking at you, you back? How you raped again? Weren't you just here a couple months ago saying you had been raped? Because I didn't know the warning signs, and I would put myself in harm's way.
Okay. What purpose or what did these high-risk behaviors provide? What did it provide for people who that talk about their trauma histories?
Create an opportunity to have a different outcome.
Okay.
It was a preemptive strike, like you said before. It's inevitable, it's gonna happen, so let me have some control over it.
Power and control, yeah.
Power and control over feeling pretty powerless. But remember, that's one of the outcomes or one of the symptoms.
Kind of preempting the inevitable.
And nothing to lose. Nothing to lose if they die, whatever.
Right.
It's maybe a relief for them.
And then you kind of have that illustration of how perception of danger changes. There's that overestimation or underestimation of danger. So putting yourself in dangerous situations or perceiving, I don't know, I work with a lot of clients who feel they're going to die when they go to Walmart versus they still don't go to Walmart and avoid because they feel like there's something bad is going to happen, but yet they put themselves at 3 o'clock in the morning in, I don't know, parking lot where the risk of being re-victimized is very high.
Yeah, Sharon at the end talks about not ever learning to distinguish between safe and dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's something, but if you're a child and the places you're supposed to be safe aren't safe, You never learn what the danger signs are. I mean, Sharon talks a lot about that, about it being, you know, she didn't know, and she'd go to the emergency room, and whoever, the nurse or doctor, whoever admitted her would say, you were just here last week, you said you were raped. How could you be raped again? And she attributes it, she didn't know not to put herself into dangerous situations, jumping out of cars, yeah.
They just believe that that's what they deserve, that they don't deserve to be treated with any dignity or any respect. It's just.
There's also, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on that, it's like they devalue themselves because everything that has happened to them shows that they have no value.
And isn't self-esteem one of the parts of us that takes a hit? You know, when we're supposed to be developing self-esteem, it's, Tina talks about she thought she had deserved to be molested by the neighbor man because she smiled at him too nicely when she took the dinner plate. Yeah.
I think that goes back to that core belief and that lack of sense of self, you know, being told over and over again, you're nothing, you're not important, you're not lovable.
And that emotional abuse, the words, yeah.
Absolutely, and that sense of, you know, being ashamed and that sense of blame, only if I didn't look this way, only if I wore something different, only if I didn't smile, then it wouldn't have happened, and taking responsibility for that abuse.
Yeah.
There's also like a secondary reward for having survived too, that kind of, while it may not make you feel a lot better, give you any additional self-esteem, the fact that you did come through it and you survived it, that's another layer on that onion, and there's some reward to it.
Getting back to making the risky behaviors and stuff, like, if you're not, a lot of what we do is what we've learned from our parents, and if you don't have parents that are teaching you by example or by words, hey, it's not safe to do this, or don't do this, then, you know, that's part of that cycle. We're going to do what we see our parents do, or just do whatever whoever tells us to.
And in our communities, right? I mean, BJ talked about that, there was the social expectation where she grew up, is that people used a lot of violence, and it can be instrumental too, and violence can be instrumental.
In a similar vein, kind of the idea of, well, I know this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I know this. This is what I know. A lot, you know, in substance abuse treatment, we say a lot of like comfort in chaos. You know, I know what the chaos is. I don't know what the other can provide for me.
The devil that we know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Last comment, then we'll.
And it's the predictability, which goes with the control. One of the best quotes I ever heard about this was, we prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
So you prevent the situation because it's familiar.
Okay, the last video then of the individuals talk about their substance use and the connection to their trauma, which may be, the dots may be a little easier to connect with substance abuse because drugs do what we want them to do, right? They serve a purpose. Whether they're therapeutic drugs or they're recreational drugs, they do something to us that we're seeking. And so I think the dots are probably connected a little more clearly with this. Whoops. Okay, did we cover all this? Yeah. I should have advanced the slides there. And imagine forming a lasting, meaningful relationship with someone who has that unpredictable of behaviors, and in terms of the triggers and the just the provocative violence, for example, it can be very detrimental. So activity page, pack page 9. Any observations that does this sound like people you know in terms of the? Imagine taking BJ's heroin away from her. Remember, she's the one who punched people in the grocery store. Got to put something in its place. You know, there's got to be a different form of coping besides the substance use, and that's where the treatment gets really hard. I mean, it requires a lot of very intensive trauma-informed treatment for people to be able to stop using their only means of coping. The thing that they can control, right? They can control the substances. They talk a lot about medicating, and we refer, a lot of times people say, well, they're self-medicating. And the fact is that many people don't have access to treatment. I mean, that is a reality of the world we live in. Hopefully it's going to get better over the next, as the Affordable Care Act does get implemented more widely, more people should have access to treatment. But there still is a waiting line, right? I mean, most of you probably have wait lists for just about any kind of treatment in your community that you want. And so people will self-medicate until they can get into treatment. You know, it makes them feel powerful, it numbs them. I realized how good it felt to feel nothing. And that's something that we know drugs do. Not to suggest anybody in this room would ever go out after bad days of work and have a drink. But you know somebody who has, and what's the purpose of that?
Relax.
Relax, forget about your day, right? You know, just not kind of take the edge off of the day or the week or the month. So it's the same, I mean, alcohol did that for a number of these people as well. And a lot of it has to do with escaping. Jane talks about her world being so miserable that she just stayed high all the time so she didn't have to think about it. And that was the way to, the substances, and as she said, she became addicted. So this is just, in summary, the diagram that we had at the very beginning. All of these, we looked at all of these outcomes, and these are, you'll see these in different places depending upon what part of the system, behavioral health or criminal justice system you work in, or the medical field. I mean, people who work in emergency rooms could give you a lot of information about the lives that your clients or your probationers live, because they're showing up in the emergency room on a regular basis. So it really is a system-wide, I mean, being trauma-informed really is engaging all parts of the community. The EMTs know exactly who the people are who are routinely transported to the emergency departments. They know who's homeless, they know when they're going to be homeless, where they're staying, and transporting them. So they should be part of your community continuum of care as well when it comes to trauma. Okay, so just to conclude this module, and then we'll take a quick break. I think all of the individuals here, starting with the officers and then certainly everyone here, talked about how their trauma and the impact that it had just permeated every part of their life. It affects their relationships, it affects their mental health, it affects obviously how much substances they use. But keeping in mind that the behavior really is about coping and survival. No one wakes up and decides, or no one puts on their high school goals for their life and say, I want to become a drug addict. That just isn't a goal that people set for themselves. It happens almost accidentally, or at least in a slower manner than I'm going to set that goal and I'm going to reach it. So it is a form of coping and survival. And for many, it can lead to justice involvement. That's often what brings them to our attention, is the fact they've been arrested, either with drugs on them, or selling drugs, or being in a larger sweep. But nonetheless, it's often being arrested for substance use is often what brings people with trauma into the justice system. It's not illegal, although it may appear to be at times, to have a mental illness. But it is illegal to have substances that were not prescribed to you, or those that are not prescriptions. That is a crime in and of itself. So that's often the entryway in, and it can reveal an awful lot about what's going on in terms of their reasons for using substances.